Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. This is week 5, so it's chapter 4 in our book, which is about ancient China. And I also want to warn you, I'm recovering from eye surgery in this lecture, so I have these reading glasses on. And I can't quite see everything as clearly as I'd like, but I'll try to get through it. So I have a picture of the book here. I know you can't read it probably on a small video, but the one thing I want you to notice, and my chapter notes are going to be a little light this week, so I'm going through the book this way. The one thing I want you to notice is that there are a lot of these dynasties or empires in China. And the reason it's so fascinating is, the book starts at 8,000, BCE, so Neolithic cultures. And these different cultures, but around 1900 BCE, you see these dynasties, and dynasties are like monarchs, like kingdoms, and they're hereditary. So these names that you see, like Shang and Zhao and Qin and Han, those are generally family names. So that's what distinguishes a dynasty from like an empire, is that it's a family-run business, if nothing else, or the leaders are hereditary in some way. So note that. But the reason I bring this up and the reason it's fascinating is because consider that the age of the United States isn't even 300 years old. And you look at these dynasties that go back thousands of years, and the length of the dynasties themselves, some of them are hundreds of years. So it's kind of fascinating, and it should make us think about the richness of Chinese culture, because to us it's all Chinese culture, but within Chinese culture it's very diverse in some ways, also in language and customs and regions. So it's something to think about. It's really fascinating. It's really different than the West where we live. So that having been said, the first thing I like to do when I approach something like the chapter of China, very similar to the chapter of India, where it seemed like really complicated and how could we remember any of this stuff and what's the point, the first thing I like to do is just make sure, especially in a survey course like this, that you know where China is, and we can look at some of the major geographical factors that influence the development of China. So I'm going to get to a map here eventually, and I'll talk about that. But as I get to the map, check out the terracotta soldiers. There's a great picture here at the beginning of this chapter, figure 4.1, very cool. And these soldiers were built to be part of the afterlife for Emperor Qin. So it's sort of like the pyramids in Egypt, where there were pharaohs were buried with wealth to take them into the afterlife. Well, Qin had this army, and read about it because it's fascinating. The other cool thing about it is, if you're a historian of innovation or a historian of technology, that the terracotta soldiers were made in assembly line techniques. So we always think of like Henry Ford and the first assembly line. No, it went way back before then, and the terracotta soldiers are fairly cool. So let me get back to a map. So here's our map of China. So again, just to get yourself grounded in a survey course, make sure you know the geography of what you're studying. So I think most of you know where China and Japan is, but if you don't be embarrassed. It's east of us. So if you were in California and you decided to walk across the Pacific Ocean, if you could, you would end up somewhere around China. I don't know exactly where, but it's on the other side of the Pacific. And so the chapter talks about China proper, and it also talks about East Asia. So the chapter also talks about the Korean Peninsula. And as we look at this map, we can see North and South Korea, and then also Japan, and then also Vietnam down here in the south. And as far as the geography goes, it influenced the history of China because China is very isolated. It's big, first of all. Most of the population early on was around these two rivers, the Yellow River. I know you can't see my pointer. The Yellow River and also the Yangtze. Let me see if I can do this tool or if that messes us up. So, okay, well, I can draw. So the Yellow River's in here, the Yangtze's in here, and that's where the civilization started. So those are important geographic factors. And then also, when you look at the fact that those civilizations developed to the east near the Great Basin and nearer to the ocean along the rivers, then they were there's a lot of distance between the Pacific coast and the west coast of China. So you get into the Himalayas and the Gobi Desert, it's some pretty tough territory. So it's not easy for people to invade China, and we really didn't see any major outside invasions until the Song dynasty and around the years 900, 800, 1000, where the Mongols from the north came through, and so that was a problem. But other than the Gobi Desert, there's the steppes out of Mongolia, which are like a semi-arid area, if you will, sort of like northern Nebraska, and then after the steppes, you have access to China. So the Mongols were the invaders. So that's the sort of the summary of the geographic parts. The other thing to make note of, again, we were talking about all of these dynasties. Again, you don't have to remember any of these. You should know, though, that the Qin dynasty, that's Qin, and let me see if I can scroll back up there. Hold on. There we go. I'm learning to use these tools. It's kind of nice. So the Qin is right here, so around 200 before the Common Era. And the reason that one's important is because it's considered the first dynasty to really unify China. Again, it was so spread out in old times when transportation was difficult. It was similar to the city-states we saw in Mesopotamia. Spread out settlements, if you will. But under Qin, it was sort of the first imperial or the first unification of China, not as we know it today, but kind of close, China proper, when you look at the map. So you should understand that. And there's some other stuff I'll talk about, what's going to be on the quiz next, and maybe incorporate some other key takeaways from the chapter. Okay, so as far as the quiz goes, let's see. The first thing you should know, and I was just talking about dynasties, you should know what a dynasty is. So what's the difference between a culture and a dynasty, for example? And the answer to the dynasty question is just to know that a dynasty is characterized by leadership that's of one hereditary lineage. So sort of like kings and a monarchy, relationships. So you need to know what a dynasty is, and that's it. It's that easy. And then the other thing you should know about is something called the Mandate of Heaven. And the Mandate of Heaven crops up in China early. And the reason it's important to know is because there's really parallels of it, in all cultures. So when we read about Egypt a chapter or two ago, we read about the pharaohs, and the pharaohs were thought to be gods, actual divinity, on earth, if you will. And so the pharaohs were thought to be the embodiment of God on earth, and the kings in Mesopotamia were thought to be anointed or appointed by God. So the Mandate of Heaven is a similar thing, where emperors and rulers would claim that their right to rule China was a commandment from heaven, if you will. So that's the mandate from heaven. And again, it's interesting because even though China developed in isolation, you see these same broad concepts as far as political theories of the day. The big political theory, being that, hey, God said or heaven said, I'm the leader, so here I am, and everyone, believed him. So, that was that. But know about the Mandate from Heaven. That'll be on the quiz. The other thing I think that's important is understanding when and how China commercialized. And again, I think it's important because it's universal to all of these cultures. So the commercialization of China really occurs in the Song dynasty. And the reason for it at that point was the development of new strains of rice that, quite frankly, were hardier. You could get an extra growing cycle in, so shorter growing cycles. And then also the development of iron tools for agriculture. So I grew up on a farm, so agriculture is important, but it's important to all civilizations because without an agricultural revolution or agricultural efficiencies, you get no civilizations. You have to have an abundance of food. Okay, you have to have a surplus of food to be able to feed people that aren't farmers, and I'll get into that at some point in another lecture. But the point is, under the Song Dynasty, you see the commercialization of China, like a market revolution, if you will, and the factors that influence that commercialization include these new strains of rice that we see, ironworking as far as iron tools for agriculture, and also the specialization of products and the specialization of occupations, very similar to what we talked about in Mesopotamia and in Egypt to some extent. So that is on the quiz. You should know that one. Since this class wants to continually think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it's important when we see markers or artifacts of gender oppression to bring those to our attention. So certainly that's the case in ancient China. You're going to read about something also in the Song Dynasty called a foot binding. And if you don't know what foot binding is, it's pretty gruesome. Basically, the deal is that girls, when they're small, their feet are bound to prevent them from growing. And what happens is when they become women or bigger people, their feet are still the size of a little girl. And this symbolized oppression because it was meant to show that women really didn't need their feet because their place was inside as a domestic and they didn't need to go out and do anything like that. So it's sort of the ultimate in gruesome oppression techniques. And there is a picture somewhere. I'll scroll as I talk. I'll never find the picture, but I'll scroll as I talk, and you can see a slipper that is made for a foot-bound woman, and it's basically a slipper with no toe or no toes. It's a short slipper, so I'll keep scrolling as I talk. Okay, so that is going to be on the quiz, so understand that symbol of gender oppression in foot binding. And then finally, one of the things, we're going to be kind of close to it, so this is appropriate. Finally, another thing on the quiz is the idea of the oracle bone. And the reason I think that's important is because, so there it talks about oracle bones right there. Slow down, slow down. Okay. Hold on, I went too far. Don't worry, I'm coming back. I know you're getting dizzy. There's the mandate from heaven we just talked about. And I'm going to get to the oracle bone. Okay. Here's the oracle bone. So the oracle bone, let me get to my fancy little marker. This is it right here. And the deal was that kings and leaders would take a bone and heat it until it cracked. And then they would interpret the crack. And by interpreting the crack, that would tell them the future, or they would make major decisions based on how a bone cracked. And also characters in the language are thought to have been developed in some instances by bone cracks through the oracle bone. So the reason I bring it up is because it's something so different than what we would ever think of, and it's something that sounds like it probably wouldn't work, but who am I to say if the oracle bone works or not? I don't know. But again, I think it's interesting because major decisions that affected millions of people are based on techniques like this, not only in China. I'm not picking on the Chinese. In all ancient civilizations, things were so different. It's a professor of mine used to say history's a strange place. And it is. So the oracle bone is one of those things. But the reason I brought it up is it is on the quiz, so know what the oracle bone is. So I think that covers everything on the quiz. I know I've spoke way too long, and I apologize. Get through the chapter the best you can. Have a great day. Be safe, and I'll see you again next week. Take care now. Bye-bye.